Ticker symbol VYM, or the Vanguard High Dividend Yield ETF, is quite often in the conversation when it comes to high quality dividend growth ETFs, or sometimes even the highest quality dividend growth ETFs across the entire markets. Now this is because VYM has a super high quality basket of holdings, a pretty straightforward strategy, it's cheap to own, and just like in the name, this ETF has been paying dividends to investors and been paying more and more in dividends over time. Now in this video, we're going to analyze VYM, see exactly how this ETF works and why it's been so successful in the past. Then later on, we're going to look at VYM's total return and go through some math and see exactly how this ETF has made so many investors rich in the past and most likely will continue to do so in the future. So if you're a long-term dividend investor looking for some high quality, maybe the highest quality ETFs to buy, make sure to stick around, drop a like down below, and let's get right into it. Real quick, for those that haven't already, make sure to go to the first link in my description and grab my new dividend investing ebook, where I share exactly how I went from $0 invested to now earning over $6,000 on a monthly basis and over $1 million invested in the markets. Along with the ebook, you're also going to receive my custom dividend tracker, where you can track your dividend progress on an ongoing basis and reach your dividend investing goals. So make sure to grab yourself a copy of my dividend investing ebook and the new dividend tracker today. It's the first link in my description. So right here on the Vanguard website, this is the provider of VYM. It says Vanguard High Dividend Yield ETF. And scrolling down, it shows product summary. It says seek to track the performance of the TSLY High Dividend Yield Index, which measures the investment return of common stocks of companies characterized by high dividend yields. Provides a convenient way to track performance of stocks that are forecasted to have above average dividend yields. Follows a passively managed full replication approach. So far, just at face value, this ETF seems like it could be perfect for a dividend investor. Like I mentioned during the intro, the expense ratio is 0.06%, so this ETF is going to be very cheap to hold on to, which is also important, especially for long-term investors. Now scrolling down, it says portfolio composition. So right now there's 553 different stocks in VYM. That is very diversified. I talked about just recently during a video that I think, especially for newer investors, diversification is going to come in handy. And I cannot say it enough, diversification is probably going to save you as a newer investor, because let's be real here, when any of us started investing, especially for those of you like myself that have now been investing for several years, looking back in the early days, we've all made some mistakes as far as single stock picking. But if you were to buy into any of the high quality dividend growth style ETFs across the board, I'm talking VYM, SEHD, VU, whatever the case might be, you're going to look back and be happy you did so, because you're diversified and because you bought into names that have a historical performance of growing consistently. So diversification is one of my biggest things that newer investors need to learn about, look into, and understand why I can help you in the future. The market cap for VYM is $133.5 billion. This is one of the biggest ETFs in the market. So we know that VYM has over 500 different stocks within the ETF. Let's learn a little bit more about what makes up this ETF in detail. So holding breakdowns, the majority of VYM is going to be financials. That's going to be the majority of your exposure. So if you, for whatever reason, want to have a ton of exposure or no exposure to financials, then VYM could or might not be the right ETF for you. The next biggest positions in VYM as far as sectors go are going to be things like consumer defensive at 12.8%, technology at 12%, healthcare at 12%, industrials at 12%, and energy just over 10%. The rest of the ETF is going to be things like consumer cyclical, utilities, communication, basic material, and real estate. Now, what's so awesome about all the different dividend growth style ETFs across the market is they all offer similar things, although different. You're going to get a little bit different of a mix of different stocks within the basket. And I find it so much fun looking through different ETFs and seeing sort of how the pie is made up and seeing what the biggest and smallest portions are. Because then looking back and seeing how the ETF has performed, the whole thing is just very fascinating. Top 10 holdings in VYM are things like Broadcom, we got JP Morgan, ExxonMobil, we got P&G, J&J, the Home Depot, Merrick, abbvie, Walmart, and Bank of America. So honestly, the top 10 holdings, I will say there's some names in the top 10 holdings of VYM that I'm a huge fan of. I actually own several of these names on their own in my portfolio, but there's also a few names in the top 10 holdings that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of. So that's also going to be a big portion when it comes to making your decision if or if not you want to invest in a specific ETF. But looking a little bit deeper into the performance of this ETF long term, this is what I was saying earlier when I was ranting that newer investors are just better off buying into high quality index funds. And this is simply because over the long term, historically, these funds have basically always traded up and to the right, at least if you hold on to them for long enough. VYM, as I film this video, is basically trading at all-time highs, more or less. And on the max time frame, you can see that VYM is up 144%, and this is since just around 2007. Now in the 1 year, VYM is up around 12%, year to date up around 11%, not even including dividends. These high quality dividend growth ETFs perform so well, which is why I'm such a big fan of them. Now to get to the fun part, you see that VYM talks about dividends. You even see dividend yield in its name. So looking at the dividend yield over the last 12 months is around 2.88%. So for an ETF that's giving you exposure to all the different names it does, for an ETF that also has grown as much as it does, 2.8, almost 3% yield is outstanding if you ask me. Now that means for every $100 that you invest into VYM, you're going to be receiving around $3 per year, more or less, in dividends. But what's even more important than that is looking at VYM's dividend growth rate, or how much more in dividends this ETF is paid year over year, which if we zoom all the way out, we're looking at around a 7% dividend growth rate, which means you're basically more or less getting a 7% raise as far as cash flow goes year after year after year. And even though that 6 or 7% raise might not seem all that substantial right away, as you stack more and more shares of high quality dividend growth style ETFs like this one, and as those quarterly dividends start to get larger, because the fact that you're stacking more and more shares, with those dividend increases, you're going to get bonuses basically. You're going to get paid more and more for doing absolutely nothing besides holding onto the asset long term. So now that we understand how VYM works, the holdings within the ETF, the performance as far as price return goes, and the dividend, looking at VYM's performance over the last 18.5 years, more or less, an investor that invested into VYM back in around 2006 for around $13 per share, with a $10,000 investment and dividends reinvested along the way, would have had an average annual total return of around 16.13%, which is insanely large. Or that $10,000 investment with dividends reinvested, of course, would have turned into $160,000. Now you might be asking, well, what would this look like without dividends reinvested? If you, for whatever reason, want to spend your dividends along the way, you still would have had an ending result of $120,000, which is nuts. Which next brings us into the final portion of this video. How much or how little could an investor invest into something like VYM with the current stats that it's offering and the current stats that it's offered historically in order to retire off the dividend income that VYM pays in the future? Well, let's attempt to figure it out. So VYM, an ETF that pays dividend quarterly with a $50,000 potential starting budget, which again, we're going to change around some numbers here, so don't worry, a $5,000 annual contribution, and an ETF that offers a 2.9% initial yield, around 7% annual dividend amount increase, like we said, around 5% more or less share price appreciation per year, 30 years invested. Now, before we go through these numbers, remember, these are all just estimations. Things could change in the future. VYM could skyrocket. VYM's dividend in the future could also move up or down. But just going off of these numbers, this is what we're looking at. Around $1,100,000 after 30 years invested, and a portfolio that now earns over $54,000 per year in dividends, which more or less could be enough to retire off of depending on what your expenses are at. Now, my biggest takeaways when it comes to the Vanguard High Dividend Yield ETF, my biggest takeaways are that this ETF is super cheap to hold on to. The diversified basket holdings seems to be the perfect mix, more or less, to offer dividend investors a massive start dividend yield, relatively speaking, substantial dividend growth, but also there's enough growth names in there that have also been making this ETF grow substantially over time. Now, that all being said, is VYM the best dividend growth style ETF across the entire market? Well, to be specific, during certain time frames, the answer is yes. It has performed better than many others, and this is at least during specific time frames. But like I've been talking about, and I always say, there's so many high quality dividend growth style ETFs across the market these days that offer massive price return, but along with that, nice dividends and dividend growth historically. So if you can't choose which one to buy into, maybe just grab a little bit of all of them. But now lastly, I want to hear from you guys down below. When it comes to dividend growth investing, what's your number one favorite dividend growth style ETF as of right now? Drop the ticker symbol in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to please drop a like and subscribe for more future content like this. Thanks as always for stopping by, and if you are interested in investing, make sure to check out these recent videos I posted right here.